The moment Margaret Holloway's manicured fingers closed around the white folding cane, every passenger in rows 12 through 18 went completely silent. 14-year-old Lily Chun froze mid-step in the narrow aisle of Flight 777, her hand still hovering in the air where the cane had been a half-second earlier. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out, she simply stood there, blind eyes wide, feeling for something that was no longer within her reach, while 40 strangers watched a grown woman snatch a disabled child's only lifeline and shove it into the overhead bin with a laugh sharp enough to cut glass. "There," Margaret said, brushing her palms together like she just tidied up a mess. "Maybe now she'll sit down and stop hitting people with that thing." Lily's hands trembled at her sides. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it over the low hum of the jet engines idling on the tarmac at Chicago O'Hare. She had flown alone a dozen times. She knew the count of steps from the jet bridge to seat 14. She knew the shape of every armrest, the exact pitch of a flight attendant's rolling cart. What she did not know in this moment was where her cane had gone. And without it, the entire world she had built out of memory and touch collapsed into darkness she could not navigate. "Ma'am, I need you to give that back right now." Flight attendant Maria Alvarez had appeared instantly, her voice steady, but her eyes blazing. She had seen a lot in 11 years of flying. Spilled drinks, tantrums, the occasional in-flight meltdown. But she had never watched a passenger physically disarm a blind child and laugh about it. She shouldn't be traveling without supervision. Margaret snapped, folding her arms as if she were the wronged party. "That cane keeps hitting my legs. I paid for this seat. I didn't pay to get assaulted by a blind girl and her stick." A woman 2 rows back gasped audibly. A man in a gray suit half rose from his seat before his wife pulled him back down. Nobody on that plane knew in that exact second just how catastrophically wrong Margaret Holloway's afternoon was about to go. Lily reached out with one hand, found the edge of the seat back, and lowered herself down without her cane. Her chin lifted, her spine straight. She had learned a long time ago that dignity was the one thing nobody could take from her, even when they tried, but her hands were shaking. And beneath the practiced calm, something in her chest had gone tight and cold. She was 14 years old, completely blind since birth, 35,000 FT from the ground she'd never seen. And the one tool that let her move through the world safely was now locked in an overhead bin above a stranger's head. She said nothing, but 3 rows away, a young man had already pulled out his phone and started recording. The overhead lights of the Boeing 737 flickered on as the cabin doors sealed shut for departure, and the temperature in row 14 dropped 10 degrees. That had nothing to do with the air conditioning. To understand why this moment mattered, why an entire cabin of grown adults would remember this afternoon for the rest of their lives, you first had to understand who Lily Chun really was, long before she ever stepped foot on Flight 777. Lily had been born blind. Her optic nerves undeveloped from the moment she took her first breath in a hospital in Seattle. Her mother had cried, not from grief, but from fear of everything her daughter might never get to do. Her father, a young airline first officer at the time, had made her a promise in the hospital nursery that night, that his daughter would never be limited by what she could not see, only expanded by everything she chose to do anyway. He kept that promise. By 6, Lily could navigate her entire elementary school unassisted. By 10, she was reading Braille faster than most of her sighted classmates read print. By 12, she had memorized the entire layout of 6 different airports because her father, David Chun, was a commercial airline pilot, and Lily refused to be the kind of daughter who stayed home while her father flew. She flew with him or near him every chance she got, tracing the shape of jet bridges with her cane, memorizing the particular hum of a 737's engines versus an Airbus, learning to love airplanes the way other kids love dinosaurs or superheroes. Her white folding cane wasn't just a mobility tool. It was in a very real sense an extension of her body, the thing that let her feel curbs before she stepped off them, detect obstacles before she walked into them, and move through crowded airports with the same confidence a sighted person took for granted. Losing it wasn't an inconvenience. It was like losing a limb in a room full of strangers who didn't understand why she suddenly couldn't move. Margaret Holloway, on the other hand, had built her entire identity around never being inconvenienced. A regional sales director for a mid-sized pharmaceutical distributor. She flew nearly every week, always insisting on upgrades she hadn't paid for, always the first to complain to a gate agent, always convinced that her time, her comfort, and her opinions mattered more than anyone else's around her. Flight attendants at 3 different airlines knew her by name, and not fondly. She had been the subject of at least 2 prior formal complaints. Both quietly settled with apology vouchers, both quickly forgotten by everyone except the crew members who had to deal with her. She had boarded Flight 777 already irritated. Her preferred window seat had been reassigned due to an aircraft swap. She'd argued with the gate agent for 6 minutes before boarding, a fact Maria Alvarez already knew because gate agents radio ahead when a passenger was, in industry parlance, hot. Margaret took her frustration onto the plane with her like carry-on luggage. And when Lily's cane brushed against her leg while the girl found her row, Margaret didn't see a blind teenager trying to locate her seat. She saw one more thing standing between her and a peaceful flight. She never once asked if the girl needed help. She simply reached out, snatched the cane, and threw it out of reach, as if disability itself were an inconvenience she had every right to confiscate. Somewhere in the cockpit 40 FT and a locked door away, Captain David Chun ran through his pre-flight checklist with his co-pilot, unaware that his daughter, flying alone this time as a personal milestone, a proud declaration of her own independence, had just had her cane ripped from her hands by a stranger 3 rows behind first class. The plane pushed back from the gate at 2:31 p.m., 1 minute behind schedule. Nobody could have known that this single minute would end up mattering more than anyone imagined. By the time the seatbelt sign chimed off at cruising altitude, Margaret Holloway had escalated from unkind to something closer to cruel. She'd spent the first 20 minutes of the flight complaining loudly to no one in particular about parents who let disabled kids fly unsupervised, ignoring the fact that Lily was sitting less than 3 F't away and could hear every single word. "It's not my job to babysit," Margaret said to the man beside her, who had gone very still and very quiet, clearly wishing he'd chosen a different seat. If she can't see, she shouldn't be wandering around a moving aircraft. "It's a liability for all of us." Maria Alvarez returned twice to retrieve the cane from the overhead bin, and twice Margaret blocked her, claiming she needed to check something in her own bag first, then conveniently taking her time. It was a petty, almost childish act of control, but it was also unmistakably cruelty dressed up as inconvenience. Each time, Lily sat with her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight, her jaw tight, saying nothing, because she had learned long ago that anger rarely won an argument with someone who had already decided you were less than human. But nobody on that plane knew that Lily Chun's silence wasn't weakness. It was the exact same discipline her father had taught every first officer he'd ever trained. When you cannot control the chaos around you, you control what's inside you, and you wait for the moment that matters. 3 passengers tried to intervene. An older woman in row 16 offered to retrieve the cane herself, only for Margaret to snap that it wasn't anyone else's business. A college student across the aisle quietly filmed the exchange, his phone tucked against his chest so Margaret wouldn't notice. And a retired Marine sergeant in row 13 stood halfway out of his seat before his wife tugged him back down, whispering that making a scene would only make it worse for the girl. Maria Alvarez, for her part, was doing everything within the bounds of her training. She'd requested backup from the senior flight attendant. She documented the incident on her tablet. She'd quietly informed the co-pilot, Officer Renata Cruz, that there was a situation in row 14 involving a minor passenger, using the deliberately vague language crew members use when they don't yet want to alarm the cabin. What she hadn't yet done, what none of them had done, was tell Margaret Holloway exactly whose daughter she was tormenting. At the 90-minute mark, Margaret made a mistake that would follow her for the rest of her life. "You know," she said loud enough for half the cabin to hear, "kids like her shouldn't even be allowed on planes without a chaperone. It's honestly kind of selfish of her parents. What if there's an emergency? She'd just be dead weight, wouldn't she?" The cabin went dead silent. Lily's hands, still folded neatly in her lap, curled into fists so tight her knuckles went pale. It wasn't the insult about her blindness that hurt the most. She'd heard versions of that before, and she'd learned to let it slide off her like rain off a folded umbrella. It was the word she used, dead weight, spoken about a child in front of dozens of strangers by a woman who had never once asked her name. Maria Alvarez's professional composure cracked for exactly 1 second. "Ma'am," she said, her voice low and dangerously calm, "that's enough." "Excuse me." Margaret's eyebrows shot up, genuinely stunned that a flight attendant would speak to her that way. "I said that's enough," Maria repeated. "You will return that cane and you will not speak to or about this passenger again." Margaret laughed, an ugly, dismissive sound. Or what, you'll write me up. Go ahead, I fly this route every week. I know how this works. What Margaret Holloway did not know, what she could not have possibly known, because she had never once looked at the girl beside her as a full human being worth learning about, was that somewhere in a locked cockpit 40 ft away, the man flying this exact aircraft, across the country had spent 14 years, building a life around the, promise that his daughter would never be diminished by anyone, and that man was about to find out exactly what had been happening in his cabin. The mid-flight meal service came and went, and something in the air had shifted, though almost nobody could name what it was. Maria kept glancing toward row 14 with an expression that mixed fury and something that looked almost like anticipation. The retired Marine sergeant in row 13 kept his eyes on Margaret with the flat, patient stare of a man who had waited out worse people than her. And Lily Chun sat with her cane still out of reach, her back straight, her face composed, giving absolutely no indication that anything at all was wrong, which strangely seemed to unsettle Margaret more than tears would have. She's not even upset. Margaret muttered to the man beside her, almost defensive now, as if Lily's calm was somehow an accusation. See, she's fine. I don't know why everyone's making such a big deal out of this, but nobody on that plane knew that Lily's calm wasn't the absence of pain. It was the presence of faith, the quiet, unshakable certainty of a girl who had grown up in airports and cockpits, who knew the sound of her father's voice through a cockpit door, and who somehow, without any way to check a clock or a screen, could always tell when a flight was approaching its final hour. At the 2-hour and 10-minute mark, Officer Renata Cruz turned to Captain Chun with a look he'd learned to recognize over 11 years of flying together. The look that meant something was wrong outside the cockpit door. "Captain," she said carefully, "there's a situation in the cabin." Maria flagged it twice now. A passenger in row 14 took a mobility aid from a young girl earlier in the flight, and has been. She paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone who knew this conversation mattered, escalating verbally about her disability. David Chun's hands did not move from the yoke, but something behind his eyes went very still. "Row 14, he repeated. "What's the passenger's name?" "The young girl." Renata checked the manifest Maria had sent through. "Lily Chun." The cockpit went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough for Renata to realize with a sudden lurch in her stomach exactly what she had just said, and to whom. "That's my daughter," David said quietly. Nobody outside that cockpit knew that Captain David Chun had spent the last 2 hours flying the exact same aircraft his blind 14-year-old daughter was sitting in, 30 rows behind him, while a stranger stripped away her independence and mocked her worth in front of 40 witnesses. And in the space of that single sentence, everything on Flight 777 was about to change. For nearly 10 minutes after Renata delivered the news, Captain David Chun said almost nothing. He ran the aircraft systems check with mechanical precision, confirmed altitude and heading with air traffic control, and monitored the instruments with the same steady hands that had guided this exact aircraft through 2 decades of turbulence, storms, and emergencies, but something had shifted in the cockpit. A quiet, coiled intensity that Renata had only seen once before, during an engine warning light over the Rockies 3 years earlier. "I need 5 minutes in the cabin," David finally said. "Captain, protocol says." "I know what protocol says," David replied, and there was no anger in his voice, only absolute certainty. "I've flown this aircraft for 6 years without ever leaving this seat mid-flight.
I am not doing it because I'm angry.
I am doing it because my daughter is sitting back there completely alone, and she does not know I am on this plane." Renata studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "I'll hold her steady. Go." What almost nobody in the cabin understood in that moment was the quiet history behind Captain David Chun's calm. He had built his entire career, and in many ways his entire fatherhood, around a single unbending principle. That competence and dignity were not things you were born with permission to have. They were things you demonstrated day after day until the world had no choice but to respect them. He had trained hundreds of first officers. He had flown through a hurricane's outer bands, over the Gulf. He had once talked a panicking passenger through a medical emergency at 38,000 FT using nothing but his voice and 14 years of composure. And every single one of those experiences had taught him the exact same lesson he now carried into the cabin of Flight 77. The loudest person in the room is rarely the one who deserves to be heard. Back in row 14, Margaret Holloway had grown almost bored with her own cruelty, scrolling through her phone, occasionally muttering about how dramatic everyone was being. Lily sat perfectly still beside her, hands folded, spine straight, giving no outward sign that anything had changed. But something had changed. Something in the quality of the air, in the low hum of conversation that had gone strangely hushed near the front of the cabin. Then the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The voice was calm, warm, unmistakably in control. The voice of a man who had said 10,000 routine announcements in his career and knew exactly how to make one that wasn't routine sound exactly like all the others. "I need to step out of the cockpit for just a few moments regarding a personal matter. First Officer Cruz has full control of the aircraft and we remain right on schedule. Thank you for your patience." For most of the cabin, it was a strange but unremarkable announcement. Pilots occasionally stepped out after all. But for Lily Chun, sitting in row 14 with no cane and no way to see the cockpit door, the sound of that voice hit her like a physical wave. Her breath caught. Her hands, still folded in her lap, began to tremble. Not from fear this time, but from something that looked almost like disbelief. "Dad," she whispered so quietly that only the man beside her, the one who'd spent the flight too intimidated to speak up, actually heard it. The cockpit door opened, and Captain David Chun stepped into the cabin in his full uniform, 4 gold stripes on each shoulder catching the cabin light. His expression a mask of professional calm that did absolutely nothing to hide the storm underneath it. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He walked down the aisle with the unhurried, deliberate steps of a man who had waited his entire career for a moment like this and intended to make every second of it count. Passengers turned in their seats. Phones rose into the air, capturing the moment before anyone fully understood what they were witnessing. Maria Alvarez straightened instinctively, her professional posture snapping back into place. A look of fierce satisfaction crossing her face for just a second before she composed herself. And then Captain David Chun stopped directly beside row 14. Margaret Holloway looked up from her phone, mildly annoyed at the interruption, and it took her a full 3 seconds. 3 seconds that would replay in her memory for the rest of her life, to understand who was standing in front of her and why every single passenger on that aircraft had gone completely silent. "Ma'am," David said, his voice low, level, and utterly devastating in its calm. "I understand you took my daughter's cane." The color drained from Margaret Holloway's face in a way that no amount of makeup could disguise. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again the way a person's does when their brain is scrambling to construct a defense for something that has no defense. She started, then stopped. It was hitting my legs. You called her dead weight, David said. And though his voice never rose above a conversational register, every word landed like a stone dropped into still water. In front of 40 people about a 14-year-old girl who has never once in her entire life needed anyone to feel sorry for her. He knelt down beside his daughter's seat, and something in the cabin seemed to soften and break open at the exact same moment. "Hey, baby girl," he said, his voice suddenly gentle, stripped of every ounce of the authority he'd carried down the aisle. "I'm here." Lily's composure, the same iron discipline she'd maintained for 1 to 2 hours, finally cracked, and she reached blindly for her father's voice, finding his shoulder, then his neck, and holding on with a fierceness that made 3 separate passengers openly cry. "You came?" she whispered. "Of course I came," David murmured against her hair. "You're my daughter. I will always come." He reached up without looking, opened the overhead bin, and retrieved the white folding cane with the same steady hands that had guided a Boeing 737 through storms and turbulence for 2 decades. He unfolded it gently and placed it directly into Lily's hands, closing her fingers around it himself, as if returning something far more valuable than a mobility aid, as if returning a piece of her that had been stolen. "Nobody takes this from you," he said quietly. "Just for her. Not ever again." The cabin erupted, not in chaos, but in something closer to reverence. Someone began clapping. Others joined. The retired Marine sergeant in row 13 rose fully to his feet this time, and nobody stopped him. Maria Alvarez pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes bright. Margaret Holloway sat frozen in her seat, surrounded by applause that was not for her. In the middle of a story that had just revealed itself to be one she could never walk back from. Captain David Chun rose from his kneeling position beside his daughter and turned slowly to face Margaret Holloway directly. The applause around them faded into a hush thick enough to feel he did not shout. He did not need to. "I have flown this aircraft for 6 years," he said, his eyes steady on hers. "In that time, I have never once left this cockpit mid-flight. Do you understand what that means? It means that in the entire history of my career, nothing has ever mattered more to me than what just happened in this cabin." Margaret's mouth opened, some half-formed excuse rising to her lips out of pure reflex. "I didn't know she was your—" "That's exactly the problem," David said, cutting her off, his voice still calm, still level, somehow more devastating for its restraint. "You didn't need to know whose daughter she was to treat her like a human being. You needed to look at a blind child struggling to find her seat and see someone who deserved basic decency. You failed that test long before you found out who I am." He turned to Maria, who was already holding out her tablet. The incident report populated and waiting. "Miss Alvarez, please file the formal report. I want every detail documented, the confiscation, the remarks, the witnesses. This will be forwarded to the airline's legal department and given the nature of what occurred to law enforcement upon landing." "Copy that, Captain," Maria said. And for the first time in 1 to 2 hours, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Margaret's composure finally shattered completely. "Wait, legal department? Law enforcement? It was a cane. It's not like I hit her. You physically took a disability aid from a minor without her consent," David said. "You verbally demeaned her in front of dozens of witnesses, several of whom have already recorded the entire incident. You referred to my daughter, a child, as dead weight and suggested her existence on this aircraft was a liability. In the state of New York, where we will be landing in approximately 40 minutes, the conduct carries real legal consequences. This is no longer a customer service matter. This is a matter for the authorities." 3 separate passengers raised their hands, unprompted, offering to serve as witnesses. The college student who had filmed quietly from across the aisle held up his phone. "I have the whole thing," he said. "Cane comments, all of it." Margaret looked around the cabin at the retired Marine standing at attention, at the older woman in row 16 who was openly glaring, at Maria Alvarez's clipped professional stillness, at 40 strangers who had watched her reveal exactly who she was, and for the first time in the entire flight, she had absolutely nothing to say. The remaining 40 minutes of Flight 777 passed differently than the first 2.5 hours had. Captain David Chun returned to the cockpit, but not before pulling Maria aside briefly to ensure that every detail of the incident, times, quotes, witness names, would be waiting for ground authorities the moment they landed. Word of what had happened rippled quietly through the cabin. Passenger to passenger, each retelling somehow making the story more remarkable rather than less, because for once the remarkable part was entirely true. Lily Chun sat with her cane resting against her leg, her fingers occasionally brushing its familiar folds as if reassuring herself it was really there. Passengers she'd never spoken to leaned across the aisle to check on her. The older woman in row 16 brought her a cup of water without being asked. The retired Marine introduced himself simply as Frank and told her gruffly that her father was the kind of man this country needs more of, which made Lily smile for the first time since boarding. Margaret Holloway, for her part, spent the descent in near total silence, occasionally glancing toward the cockpit door as if hoping the entire incident might somehow reverse itself. It would not. Somewhere over New Jersey airspace, Maria Alvarez quietly informed her that airport police had been notified and would be meeting the aircraft upon arrival. Standard procedure, she explained, for a documented in-flight incident involving assault of a minor's assistive device and discriminatory conduct. "Assault," Margaret repeated, her voice thin. "It was a cane. I just moved it." "You took a blind child's mobility device and placed it deliberately out of her reach," Maria said, her voice flat and professional, betraying none of the satisfaction she felt. "Legally, that's exactly what it's called." When Flight 777 touched down at John F. Kennedy International Airport at 5:47 p.m., 7 minutes behind schedule, the aircraft taxied to the gate in a silence that felt entirely different from the tense hush of takeoff. As the seatbelt sign chimed off, 2 Port Authority officers boarded the aircraft before general deplaning began, walking directly to row 14 under Maria Alvarez's direction. "Margaret Holloway?" one officer asked. Margaret's face had gone the color of old paper. "This is completely unnecessary. It was a misunderstanding, ma'am. We have a documented incident report, multiple witness statements, and video evidence of a passenger seizing a disability assistance device from a minor and making discriminatory remarks about her disability," the officer said. "You'll need to come with us." The cabin watched in near total silence as Margaret Holloway was escorted off Flight 777 in handcuffs. Her designer bag left behind in the overhead bin, her face a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror as the reality of her afternoon finally caught up with her. Nobody applauded this time. Nobody needed to. The silence itself was its own kind of verdict. What happened next unfolded with the swift, merciless efficiency of modern consequence. Within 72 hours, the video recorded by the college student, 31 seconds of Margaret Holloway laughing as she called a blind 14-year-old deadweight, had been viewed more than 11 million times across social media platforms. News outlets picked up the story within a day, running headlines that all circled the same devastating detail. A pilot's blind daughter, humiliated on his own flight, defended in a moment captured by dozens of witnesses. Margaret's employer, the pharmaceutical distribution company where she'd worked for 9 years, issued a statement within 48 hours confirming her immediate termination, citing conduct fundamentally incompatible with the values of our organization. Her professional network, built over a decade of aggressive networking and LinkedIn posturing, evaporated overnight. Former colleagues who had once praised her ambition now scrubbed her from their connections. Unwilling to be associated with the woman in the viral video, the airline placed Margaret Holloway on a permanent no-fly list, a decision rarely made for a single incident, but justified in their formal statement by the severity and public nature of the discriminatory conduct toward a minor passenger. Criminal charges followed within the week. Reckless endangerment and a hate crime enhancement tied to disability discrimination filed by the Queens County District Attorney's Office. After reviewing witness statements and video evidence, civil attorneys representing the Chun family confirmed a lawsuit was being prepared, though David Chun made it clear in every interview that the money mattered far less to him than the message. This was never about punishment for its own sake, he told one national morning show. Lily, seated quietly beside him, her cane resting against her chair. It was about making sure my daughter and every child like her knows that the world will stand up for them, even when I'm not in the room. Lily herself, when asked by the same interviewer how she felt in the moment her cane was taken from her, answered with a composure that stunned the entire viewing audience. "I wasn't scared of losing my cane," she said. "I've navigated the world without help plenty of times. I was scared of what it meant that a grown woman looked at me and decided I didn't matter. That's the part that actually hurts. But my dad taught me that people who need to make themselves feel big by making someone else feel small are usually the smallest people in the room." The clip of that answer alone was replayed for weeks. Maria Alvarez was formally commended by the airline for her professionalism and advocacy throughout the incident. And in a quiet twist that felt like poetry to everyone following the story, she was later invited by Captain Chun to serve as an honorary guest at Lily's high school graduation 2 years later, a bond forged at $30,000. Tea of turbulence that never quite faded. The retired Marine, Sergeant Frank Drowski, became something of a minor celebrity himself after his brief but powerful interview clip. The kind of man this country needs more of went viral alongside the rest of the story, prompting an outpouring of support from veterans organizations who adopted the phrase as something of an unofficial motto. And Margaret Holloway, once a woman who demanded upgrades and complained her way through every flight she took, found herself unable to book a commercial flight anywhere in the country. Her name flagged permanently across multiple airline databases. Her professional reputation dismantled in the span of a single viral week, her name forever attached to 31 seconds of footage she could never take back. 6 months after Flight 777, David Chun stood at a podium at a regional aviation conference, invited to speak not about flight safety or aircraft systems, but about something the organizers called dignity in the skies. Lily sat in the front row, her cane resting against her chair. A new charm, a small silver airplane, a gift from Maria Alvarez, clipped to its handle. "My daughter has been blind since the day she was born," David told the room, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had once made an entire cabin fall silent. And in 14 years, she has never once needed anyone to feel sorry for her. What she needed, what every person navigating this world with a disability needs, is not pity. It's basic respect. It's the simple decency of being seen as a full human being before anything else. He paused, glancing down at his daughter, who offered him a small, knowing smile. On a flight from Chicago to New York, a stranger decided my daughter's cane was an inconvenience worth stealing. What that stranger didn't understand is that dignity isn't something you can take from a person just because you have the power to try. My daughter sat in that seat, cane gone, surrounded by people who mocked her. And she never once stopped being exactly who she was, strong, composed, and worthy of respect. It wasn't my arrival that gave her dignity back. She never lost it. My arrival simply made sure everyone else in that cabin finally saw what had been true the entire time. The room rose in a standing ovation that lasted nearly a full minute. Justice, in the end, is rarely as loud as the cruelty that demands it. It doesn't always arrive with sirens or handcuffs or viral videos, though sometimes when the world is watching closely enough, it does. But the real justice of Flight 777 wasn't the arrest or the lawsuit or the 11 million views. It was a 14-year-old girl who never once believed, not for a single second, even in her darkest moment on that plane, that she was anything less than exactly enough. Cane in hand or cane taken away, seen by strangers or not seen at all, blind since birth and clearer in her worth than anyone who ever tried to diminish her. Margaret Holloway was escorted off Flight 777 in handcuffs, her career and reputation collapsing behind her within a week. Captain David Chun walked back to his cockpit that same afternoon to a standing ovation from an entire cabin of strangers who would never forget what they'd witnessed. But it was Lily Chun, sitting quietly with her cane back in her hands, who taught every single person on that aircraft the one lesson that mattered most. Some people spend their whole lives trying to make others feel small.